Hey guys, it's Jessica.
And this is Kendra, and you're listening to Lucid Lab. I just got done spending half of my paycheck at Costco, and I was running a little bit late. Every time I go there with an idea of how much I'm going to spend, it's usually at least $100 more.
I wouldn't know. I don't have a membership or anything. I always say I want to go with one of you guys.
You should come with me sometime.
I need to, because Christmas is coming up, and I know they have some good deals on kid stuff around Christmas time.
You get sucked into buying way more than you were planning to. That's the problem.
I can imagine.
Today they were sampling things, and of course you try it and you're like, I wasn't gonna buy that, but like I bought some kind of pesto chicken lasagna because they were, sampling it, and I'm like, yeah, that's really good. That would be a nice easy dinner one night.
I don't know if this is the right way to say it. Spanakopita.
Mm-hmm.
That's how I found out about those and fell in love with those because I had samples at a Costco one day.
I just bought a 48 pack of those today because my child loves those as well. And I like to have things in the freezer that are just really easy when we've had a long day, because you and I both have long days all the time. And I don't feel like cooking, and I feel like I eat out too much because of that. And so having Costco meals to fall back on is really nice. It's about to get cold here. We're supposed to get our first snow, and I realize I'm not ready for winter yet.
I'm not either. They never give us fall for more than a day. It's really annoying.
I live in Colorado, and I don't love snow.
For me, it's just getting around, and it extends the mornings trying to get her to school and everything.
It's so much work. I do love how snow looks if I don't have to go anywhere. I love to be in my house and looking at the beautiful snow outside.
But that's only if it hasn't been trampled through or cars haven't driven by and turned it into poop-looking snow. It's only
true.
Pretty for a little bit of time.
Yes.
So next week is going to be really busy for me. My daughter is a part of a lot of different things, and I don't know where I missed the emails where this was happening, but I went to pick her up and I heard a little girl at the front office say something about the talent show.
Oh, no.
And my daughter has always been in them. And I was like, talent show? So I really quickly emailed the music teacher and I'm like, did we miss tryouts?
Yeah.
And she's like, yeah, the talent show's next week.
Oh, shit.
And I was like, my daughter's going to kill me. Is there any way she can still be in it? Thankfully, the music teacher knows my daughter and knows that she can sing pretty well.
Yeah.
And she's like, well, someone dropped out, so I'll let her be in it. So my daughter, with no practice whatsoever, is going to be in the talent show on Thursday.
Oh, wow. What's she singing?
She's singing Dream by Priscilla On. I don't know if you know what that is. It's kind of a sad song. I think every verse is like about a different time in your life. And like the last verse is essentially saying, I'm willing to leave and die and go to heaven. God. So, but she sings it really pretty. The problem is we haven't had her practice with just the instrumental, which is really similar the entire song. So I don't know if she's going to be able to time herself on it, and she's not really going to have practice. So
yeah.
And this is the first time it's going to be judged. Like they're giving trophies and stuff.
Okay.
And she's like, do you think I'll get one or two? I'm like, I don't know, honey. Everybody else has practiced for over a month and you're doing one take and then
and hoping for the best.
So at least she gets to be in it.
That's the important thing.
Yeah, we'll see. All righty. What do you have for us this week?
I am going to be exploring a chilling case. It is from the 1920s, and it was dubbed by a paper as the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders.
I do not think I've heard of it.
How I came to this case is based on a movie that some of you may have seen. I don't know if you've seen it, Jessica. It's called The Changeling.
Oh, I have seen that, but it's been years.
For those of you who have not seen it, it is about the story of the disappearance of Walter Collins, and Angelina Jolie plays Walter Collins' mother, Christine, in it. And we'll get into the whole story because it is a just unbelievable case of police neglect, abuse, things like that. So I watched that movie, and that brought to light that there's more story than just Walter Collins going missing. And so the Wineville Chicken Coop Murders occurred in the quiet community of Wineville, California, which is a suburb east of Los Angeles. This gruesome tale, it is bad. I felt like, Jessica's done a lot of really dark stories, and it's, I guess, my turn now.
It is. We've talked about it.
This does involve the abduction, captivity, abuse, both physical and sexual, and murder of young boys between the age of 9 and 16.
Okay.
It's not a light case to discuss. So this is my trigger warning that I'm giving you right now, that the details of this case will be dark and they will take us to the depths of human depravity.
Okay, great.
So in 1928, young boys went missing around the suburbs of Los Angeles, and the police were receiving a lot of heat from the citizens to solve what was happening to their children. Parents were afraid during a time when kids openly walked their neighborhoods to visit stores, the movies, or their friends' houses. There were rumors going around about a man picking up boys by offering them rides in his fancy car, luring them with the age-old trick of candy, or even saying that he had a puppy.
Oh.
Boys would get in the car with him and never be seen again.
You would think children would say no to that now, but
they don't.
They don't.
Because
candies and puppies.
They know how to get it. Yeah, they know how to really suck children in. It is believed that Walter Collins was a victim of the Chicken Coop murders. And the perpetrator today that we'll be talking about is a very sick, twisted human being, and his name is Gordon Stewart Northcott. He goes by Stewart, and that's how I'll refer to him for this episode. Shockingly, he was only 19 years old when he began committing these unspeakable acts.
Oh, you don't just turn into it in your 20s.
No. It always
started early.
He was a sociopathic serial killer before the term serial killer had even been created. While he would only officially be charged with the murder of 3 boys, it is believed that he had many more victims, closer to 20 in the short course of 1 year, that were killed. Yes. But he wasn't alone in his horrific crimes. His mother, Sarah Louise Northcott, would confess and be brought to trial as a willing accomplice in these young boy murders.
So he was her first victim.
Who?
His mother.
As far as like he was the victim of his mother. Yes, we'll get into this tangled web of fucked up family that we hear all too often on this show.
Why can't you just have a normal relationship with your children?
It's not that hard, I don't think, but it makes me question everything. Every time I see a family now, I'm like, what's really going on?
Or children.
Alongside his mother, he had a young nephew, Sanford Clark. He is also a large part of this story. Sanford would find himself in an impossible situation, being forced to live with his uncle at the age of 13, enduring years of abuse himself, and eventually being forced into committing atrocities against other young boys that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I am today bringing you this House of Horror story. There are just way too many things going on behind closed doors in houses all across, I'd say America, but also the world.
Very true. And yeah, I think we will stick to just creating a series out of this, because you did Ariel Castro, and then when we did Shelley Notek, I'm like, but this is a House of Horrors too. They're all House of Horrors.
Yes. And then we had the Hart family.
Yeah. That was very different,
and this one I guess could be a farm of horrors, because it is going to take place at a farm out in the middle of nowhere. But for Sanford Clark specifically, it was absolutely horrific house that he was forced to live in. To try and understand the monster that would become known as the Chicken Coop Murderer, we first need to take a look at his parents, because of course they have a story of their own to bring someone like this into the world, especially since his mother was involved. So Sarah Louise Carrathorpe was likely born on August 26th of 1869, although we aren't for sure because record keeping wasn't the best at the time, and she didn't even really know her own birthday to tell you. Something we will also learn later about Sarah Louise, who would drop her first name and only go by Louise, so I guess that's a common thing in their family to just go by the middle name. She was a known pathological liar. She was born in Strathroy, Ontario, Canada, to immigrant parents who had recently moved to Canada from Devonshire, England. She was one of 3 daughters. Other than that, little is known about Louise prior to her marriage to George Northcott, who was a native Canadian from London, Ontario. His parents were farmers, and he had 2 brothers. George and Louise were married on August 12th of 1886. George was 20 years old and Louise was 17. Their first child, a daughter, Winifred, was born just a few years later. Louise was very religious, almost to the point of fanaticism. She had this romantic view of life and a very vivid imagination. She was not grounded much in reality. George, on the other hand, was an avowed atheist with a highly nervous temperament that could often manifest as a violent and uncontrollable temper. So they were an interesting couple and very volatile.
How'd they come together?
I don't even know.
Strange.
He also suffered from severe headaches.
Oh.
Once Winifred, who they called Winnie, was born, they both felt overwhelmed and restricted by parenthood. But yet they went on to have a second child. His name was Willie. But they would separate just 5 years into their marriage because parenting was just too much. and they had a very weird dynamic. I don't think they should have ever come together.
No, it doesn't sound like it.
And then they had kids, and they were stuck in the middle of this. So they separated, but then tragedy would strike. Willie would contract pneumonia and die at the young age of 6.
Oh, okay.
This brought them back together, and they would then stay together until, I guess, death do us part.
Interesting.
After the death of Willie, Louise became quite depressed. Winnie would describe her mother as deranged. She was crying all the time, and she began to renounce and curse God for taking her baby. Louise would go on to birth 4 more children, but all of them would die in early infancy.
Oh.
Like I said, the couple would stay together through all of this, but each death of the child would cause Louise to spiral more and more.
Well, yeah.
You can't fault a woman for that. That would be a lot to take on.
Yeah.
She lost her faith in God.
Well, yeah, you would feel
How
cursed.
would you not?
5 children.
She did feel cursed.
Yeah.
From several accounts I found while researching this case, it was not a happy home. Not only were they often engaged in shouting matches, it would turn violent, with George physically abusing Louise. And there was also several sources. I couldn't get it completely perfect because this is from the 1920s, but there were a few sources that mentioned there was sexual abuse towards Winnie from her father.
Okay.
They also mentioned that she was not only abused by her father, but also by some family friends and uncles that would come over. So Winnie had a rough life. She would later write a 3,000-page summary of how horrible life was growing up in her parents' home. She would bring this to the court when her brother Stewart would be brought to trial for the crimes that we're about to talk about. But she never, in that 3,000-page, specifically addressed if she was sexually abused. So that's all conjecture.
Okay. It would seem like the time to bring it up.
Probably.
Yeah.
At the age of 36, Louise found herself unexpectedly pregnant again, but she was not happy about it. At this point, Winnie was their only surviving child, and she was almost grown.
Yeah.
George saw it as a bad omen and told her she must do everything in her power to end the pregnancy. She tried to force a miscarriage by violently jumping up and down, excessive horse riding, and many other measures. When she was 7 months pregnant, her and George got into a violent altercation that resulted in him kicking her so hard in the stomach that it injured her spine.
Oh.
But miraculously, the pregnancy continued, and Louise would give birth to George Stewart Northcott on November 9th of 1906.
Oh, this baby was not born from love.
Exactly.
Wow.
He's coming into a very unwelcome world.
Yeah.
And you can't help but wonder if that influences what he becomes.
A stain on his soul.
It was said that Louise didn't even want to look at her newborn baby because she was upset at the fact of being a mother again. It was not a happy time for the family. In fact, we don't even really know for sure that November 9th is the date Stewart was born because his parents didn't bother making a note of the actual day.
Oh.
Louise would go on to suffer from severe postpartum depression, and she was very uninterested in caring for her newborn baby. So much of that caretaking fell to her then 17-year-old daughter, Winnie.
Right, I imagined.
And because of how old Winnie was, and after being an only child for many years, she was happy to take on this motherly role towards Stewart, and she really would see him as her child. We'll see throughout the whole story.
Okay.
Much more than a sister. But at some point, Louise began recovering and coming out of this postpartum depression. It would manifest into something else completely because she would go from hating her newborn child and not wanting anything to do with him to becoming absolutely obsessed with her new baby boy in an unhealthy way. He would become her entire world.
But just for like days at a time or?
No, for the rest of his life.
Oh.
So his mother, I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden she looked at Stewart and she saw this perfect child that could do no wrong.
I understand if she had this baby, she didn't want it, super depressed after it, but then eventually coming out of that and seeing that it was her opportunity to make everything right after losing 5 children.
True. But she's going to go the extreme.
Okay.
Which we have talked about. I think we just talked about it last week with Daniel LaPlante. When a mother dotes too much on their son, doesn't end well. And right at the same time, when he was now 18 and she got married to a man named John Clark. So she was moving out of the childhood home, which just meant that Louise had even more energy to focus just on Stewart.
Okay.
At the age of 7, Stewart would move with his family to Vancouver, and by all accounts, he was a bright and popular child at school, very social, and seemed to enjoy being the center of attention. His mother would continue to dote on him and give him literally everything he wanted, and he was never told no or given any discipline. Even George and Winnie knew to tread lightly when it came to Stewart, because if they said anything that wasn't positive towards her darling baby boy, they would begin incurring her wrath. She became super mama bear in a really bad direction. She would always choose Stewart over anybody else. And if he said something happened, she believed him over her own husband or older daughter.
It's dangerous for that boy because he thinks he can do no wrong.
Exactly.
Yep.
Because of this, Stewart would become a very manipulative and entitled child, and these traits would follow him through the rest of his life. We can't overcorrect for our kids. You got to keep it balanced.
Right.
But Stewart would later recount that his home life was not all rainbow and sunshine, even though his mother doted on him. He would claim later during his trial, and maybe even before that, that his father, George, began to sodomize him at the age of 9.
But why?
I tend to believe this because of what's going to happen and what we're going to see Stewart do later in life.
Yeah.
But it also came up at trial when he was trying to save himself from a death penalty. And we'll find out that Stewart takes after his mother in the pathological lying.
Yeah.
He also claimed that his mother would dress him up in girls' clothing and make him play with dolls. Stewart was also said to have a higher pitched voice even as he entered adolescence, and he was described as being very feminine.
Okay.
In 1918, around the age of 12, Stewart suffered a serious head injury after slipping on a patch of ice. It was reported that he had a brain hemorrhage and that for weeks after the incident, his mind seemed a little off and he was never quite the same after. So we've got all of these years of trauma already. Maybe if his dad was abusing him, his mom spoiling him, and now we add in a head injury, it's like, of course, he's not going to be okay.
Sounds like Fred West.
Kind of.
Yeah, his mother was the same exact way with him. He could do no wrong.
Yes.
And, there's sexual abuse there, and he was very manipulative, and he had a head injury, and they said after that, it was done.
There's a big, study and connection with serial killers' head injuries, so...
Ugh.
So this boy was doomed from the start.
Sounds like it.
Doesn't excuse what he's going to do, but we have to look at the child and know that something went off here.
It's like there should be some kind of checkup on kids who have head injuries.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Are you having any kind of dark thoughts?
Exactly. Check on them a year later and see how they're coping socially.
It's true.
Makes me think of football players.
Oh, God. And a lot of boxers and things that become violent later in life.
Yeah.
To add to all of this, during puberty, Stewart began to grow black hair all over his body in excess to normal. In fact, his mother would take him to doctors to try and see if there was something they could do to stop the hair growth because it was so much.
The demons coming out of him.
Maybe. Kids at school began picking on him.
Yeah.
He couldn't cover it up. It was everywhere. And they were calling him Ape Man.
That just seems like salt in a wound with what his life has been already.
I know. You want to feel sorry for him right now. I know what's going to happen in the future, but yes, this would be absolutely horrible. Stewart was very interested in the arts, specifically music, and he aspired to be a concert pianist. And he was very talented.
Okay.
He also spent many hours reading books. He was very into Shakespeare and Charles Dickens. He seemed to have a pretty good life. He got whatever he wanted from his parents, including a very nice car when he turned 16. This also reminds me of Fred West.
Didn't you say this in 1920s?
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Yeah, he was spoiled then.
Yes, and it was a car with a convertible top.
Wow.
So he would drive around town showing off. He also had a lot of nice clothing, and it was said that he dressed very different than other boys at the time. He would wear bold colors and patterns, which was not something you would see often in Canada at the time. He found jobs working in jazz bands and playing piano at the grocery store, which was apparently a thing back in the day. He seemed like he was headed in the right direction at this point. He's 16 years old. But what most people didn't know until later is that this car was actually what prompted and was the catalyst to begin his more sinister side.
Abducting kids.
Yes, he would supposedly begin using this car to lure in people off the street to come take a ride in his nice car, and it was different than most people in the area. Unfortunately, those that he was asking to get in the car with him were young boys that he was actually attracted to.
Okay.
There are no known documented cases of Stewart actually assaulting boys during this time, but I did find one source that mentioned that at the age of 15, while visiting a town called Kamloops, he was accused of attempting to molest a 10-year-old boy. So I think there was some signs starting at this time.
Okay.
To me, this is also interesting, is that just out of the blue, for reasons unknown, his family decided to leave the area. And I did also see some sources where it seemed like some neighbors maybe were questioning.
Yeah, so starting somewhere new, getting away from the rumors.
Yes. So the family would leave Canada altogether and move to Los Angeles. It's now August of 1924 and Stewart is 18 years old. George was able to find a good job as a contractor and builder, and Louise began working at the LA County General Hospital.
It's so weird because when you started this story, I'm like picturing this family in the backwoods, and then it's like you just zoomed into modern times. I don't know.
I guess the 20s were a boom time in America and maybe in Canada as well. I don't know much about Canada, but they were in Vancouver, which is a big city. So
okay.
I would assume that it does seem like they were pretty well to do.
Okay.
I mean, who else is buying their 16-year-old a convertible?
Interesting.
It seemed like George had steady work and was able to provide very well for the family. And Louise worked as well, which to me is interesting because back in the 20s, I don't know that many women were working, but it was also Canada, and that may be different than what it was like in America.
True. We know nothing. We really don't. It's like as close to us as it can be, and yet I know nothing.
So different.
I know.
So when they got to Los Angeles, Stewart would start attending classes nearby at a college. Didn't say which one. I'm guessing just a community college with music program. And then he was working part-time as a car salesman. While Stewart had sometimes been made fun of in Canada for his flamboyant clothing, here in Los Angeles, he seemed to fit in. And his mother was excited for this future among those who embrace the arts like her son. Something, I guess I'll pause right here. I don't have this written down, but I do want to also talk about, this is the 1920s and homosexuality was not embraced. In fact, it was illegal. Mm-hmm. But Los Angeles was one of those areas that was more open, just as it is today. Like California's our most probably liberal state. So it was kind of the same thing. And I think although Louise probably didn't want to admit it to herself, or George, they probably knew that their son was gay.
Yeah.
But everybody suppressed everything back then. So when I was reading these articles, because a lot of them are back from the 1920s and everything like that, it's like they're saying that he was, gay with his flamboyant clothing and things like that. Something that I find really disturbing is that back then, I think I talk about this later, a lot of times because homosexuality was not embraced and it was seen as like
the devil's work.
Yeah, and it was also seen as very deviant behavior, and they would always lump gay people with pedophilia.
Yeah.
And I hate that. And they still sometimes try to do that today.
It's true. Yeah.
There's a lot of those themes that I don't like in this story.
Yeah, and it is specific to older men with younger boys.
Yes.
So, sorry, that's not being gay. That is being a pedophile.
Correct.
Get it straight.
So while George and Louise were happy for their son, it seemed like it was going to be more of a place that he could flourish in Los Angeles. What they didn't know is that the move to LA only made it easier for Stewart to begin embracing that dark side again.
Yes, I can see that.
Stewart started to hang out with a friend from school that he met named Claude Scott, and his family was excited to see him making friends so soon. And Stewart was constantly going over to their house. The Scott family loved him. Unfortunately, what they didn't know at the time was that Stewart wasn't really coming over to hang out with his friend Claude. Instead, he had his eye on Claude's little brother, Philly, who was somewhere between the age of 9 or 12. Whenever Stewart could get Philly alone, he would assault the boy, and it would go on for a while. But at some point, it did come to light, and the parents pressed charges against Stewart.
Good.
Yes.
The audacity of these pedophiles, though.
It's horrible.
To just take a child into another room and assault them.
Yes, and then tell them, I'll kill your family, or I don't know what he tells them. Yeah, but they know how to do this. So on July 25th of 1925, Stewart Northcott would be arrested for statutory rape. However, he would not face any consequences.
Of course not.
One account said that the charges were dropped, and another said that Stewart was placed on probation. So I don't know exactly which one it was, but we do know he never had to go to jail. And he once again faced no consequences for his behaviors, as he had his whole life so far. Also of note is during the summer and fall of 1925, Stewart was working at a nearby grocery store, and his boss actually described him at the time as being a real weirdo and a pathological liar.
Okay.
He recalls Stewart even telling him that at one point his mother was dead. He said that he, missed a shift because his mother was hit by a car, but it was really easy to find out that's not true.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I've known a couple liars like this growing up. The shit that just comes out of their mouth for no reason. And it's always very intense and dramatic, like things that you would be like, wow, I can't believe that happened. But they say it as easy as saying the truth,
yeah,
it's crazy to me. Why did you make all that up for no reason? But there's something in their brain that just, it's easier for them to make up an entire story and just spit that out and move on with their lives with no consequences than to say, well, it took me 5 extra minutes to get here because I was late.
I got caught in traffic.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like their brain doesn't connect the fact that they're going to get caught.
To be something fantastical.
Is it for attention, maybe?
But I don't even think that they know that that's why that they're doing it for that reason. I don't know if it's for attention. I grew up with a girl who would do this, and she was doing it as early as 5 years old.
Wow.
And it lasted until I really wasn't friends with her anymore. But you could never trust anything she was saying because there was a really good chance that it was a lie that she came up with 2 seconds ago.
And maybe Stewart learned it from his mother because we know she was that way as well. Or he just inherited the gene that makes you a pathological liar.
Yeah.
I'm not real sure.
Yeah.
Coincidentally, while he was working at this grocery store, there was a little boy that would often come in to pick up his mother's grocery orders. And that boy was 7-year-old Walter Collins, who we know will come back into the story soon as an unfortunate victim. In 1926, young boys were known to hang out on Pasadena Avenue's Arroyo Seco district, and some of them were sex workers, despite them being minors.
Okay.
According to reports, neighbors of the Northcotts had seen Stewart in that area soliciting young boys for sex. In fact, it came to be known when there was this sting operation and they arrested some of the boys in the area. When they were interviewing, they kept talking about this person they called the Sheik of Pasadena Avenue. And that was actually Stewart Northcott because he had the nice car and he was seen there so often. But once again, I'm going to bring back up what I just discussed with what was going on at the time. And people didn't really care about these young boys because they were associated with being gay.
Right.
And they were just like, whatever, you were performing homosexual acts, it doesn't matter that you were underage. And it's really sad. Nothing was done to anybody that was taking advantage of these young boys at the time.
Just like sex workers.
It is. Another story from this time involves the Northcott's next door neighbor in Highland Park, Los Angeles. His name was Dr. Ernest Tracy. He thought Stewart was a nice, charming young man from a good family and would often talk to him coming and going out of the house or out on the street. One day, Stewart asked him questions about death and what happened to the body afterwards. The way it came across didn't alarm the doctor at the time, but in retrospect, he realizes that it was a more ominous question. He thought it was just a curious young man at the time. And so somehow they got on this topic of death, and Stewart asked how they disposed of the bodies once a person had passed, like in the hospital. And Dr. Tracy mentioned that the quickest way to dissolve a human body is with the use of quicklime, which is also known as calcium oxide. It's a chemical that has many industrial uses. Many of us know of it being used in cement. It's a highly caustic substance that, because of its uses in many industries, is very easy to get.
Why is he having that conversation with him then? It's not like he was like, well, the morgue comes and gets it. He's telling him how to boil it down to nothing.
Yeah, I think
that's a weird conversation.
Odd. Yeah.
Oh, I looked back and I wondered why I told him how to get rid of a body.
That should trigger red flags, but maybe in the 1920s it was like, oh, that's just what we all talked about. It was death and gloom and all of that. So after all of the attention with the statutory rape charge and then being known to frequent the Arroyo Seco area, it seems Stewart wanted to have less visibility into his life. And so he told his parents, just kind of out of the blue at the time, that he wanted to change his career path. He had been studying the arts and planning to pursue work in music, but all of a sudden he decided that what he really wanted to do was move out of the city and become a farmer.
Oh, okay.
He convinced them that it would be good for him to learn hard manual labor. This is a boy who has never lifted a finger in his life. And he wanted to learn how to grow his own food and tend to animals. His parents were definitely shocked, to say the least.
But anything for my little boy.
Exactly. And that's what happened is Louise is like, if he wants to do this, let's help him. So his parents went out and purchased property, 3 acres to be exact, in Wineville, California, so he could start this dream of a chicken farm.
I was wondering when the chicken coop was going to come in.
Yeah. So after the purchase of the land, then George was asking him how was he planning to get the farm up and running. Stewart had a wonderful idea. His sister Winnie, who is now 37 years old and has 3 kids of her own, he was going to drive up to Canada and see if she would let him borrow, I guess, or take one of her children to come down and help him set up the farm.
Why? You don't need child labor.
This is where we will sadly see Sanford Clark get mixed up in Stewart's web.
Okay.
Many of the details that I know for this story will come from Sanford.
Okay.
Because he's going to be there for it all, sadly. So Stewart drove from California back up to Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, to spend 2 weeks with his sister Winnie and her family. She was married to John Clark, and as I said, she had 3 children of her own. Her eldest was a daughter named Jessie, and she had 2 boys, Kenneth and Sanford. Now, remember how I said Winnie really viewed Stewart as a child of hers too, since she was grown when he was a baby. So he was only a couple years older than her daughter, Jessie. Her daughter was, I think, 16 at this time, and Stewart was 19.
Gotcha.
Winnie would always baby Stewart when he would come around. Winnie's children always thought it was odd. They seemed that the relationship between their mother and her brother was more like boyfriend-girlfriend.
Oh, boy.
She babied him just as much as his mother did. So Winnie will see the same themes. She'll always cover for him, and she'll always do whatever Stewart wants.
She might have done some stuff to him when he was little then.
Maybe, because it was done to her.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's that cycle, we know. Winnie's husband, John Clark, was a weak man. Winnie definitely wore the pants in the family, and everyone did whatever she said. It sounded like she had a very volatile temper, similar to her dad growing up. Her children were afraid of her, and they all said that it was also not a happy home. The cycle continues.
It's so ridiculous.
So sad. When Stewart suggested that Winnie should give him one of her children to come work at the ranch, he initially had his eye on her 11-year-old Kenneth. But Kenneth was Winnie's favorite child, and she would not budge on letting him leave her side. She also thought her 13-year-old son Sanford was more prone to laziness, and that going to California and working on a farm with his uncle would be good for him.
I mean, 13 is not that young. I can see a mom being like, yeah, go teach him some skills.
Especially, yeah. In the 1920s, people are getting married at like 18.
Right.
Like, yes, you need to go man up or whatever.
Yes.
Sanford noticed his mother and uncle whispering and sneaking around, and then his mom began packing his bags, and he got worried. None of the kids liked their Uncle Stewart. They said he had a weird, creepy vibe about him, and they were just counting the days for him to leave whenever he would show up.
Oh, and then poor Sanford's like, you're making me go with him?
Sanford was terrified when his mother told him he would be going on a road trip with Stewart. She lied to him at first, saying that they were just going to visit Regina, Canada, but eventually he got it out of them or overheard their true intentions in one of their whispering sessions that he was going to be sent to California. He begged and he begged for her to keep him home. He felt like his uncle wasn't a safe place and he did not want to be alone with him. Kids have this instinct.
Sometimes, unless they agree to take candy or puppies.
Like, unless the guy has a puppy.
Right.
And then all bets are off. Even like women fall for that. Serial killers have gotten women to come to them with the puppy.
Well, because they'll wait in a parking lot and have literal puppies.
I know.
Like in a box or something.
That's how Ariel Castro got people to come into his house.
That's right.
Remember the puppies? Yep. So Sanford went to his older sister and he told her what the plan was, and he was like, please help me. I cannot go with Uncle Stewart. He even contemplated running away, but Jessie calmed him down. She assured him that he would not be there long. She would find a way to get down to the U.S. She was almost 18. I'll save up money. I'll come get you. All of this. because she did love her little brother. It sounds like the siblings
were
close in a good way,
right?
Not in a weird way, like Winnie and Stewart.
Trauma bonding.
Yes. She just told him to write her often and tell her exactly what was happening, and she would do everything in her power to keep him as safe as she could. He left believing that he would only be going to work with his uncle for 1 year. Stewart also promised Winnie that while Sanford was working on the farm, he would make sure he was still going to school, he would be enrolled and continuing his education.
Okay.
And with that, after hugging his sister more tightly than ever before, 13-year-old Sanford was put in the car with his creepy Uncle Stewart and driven hundreds of miles away from his home.
Aww.
They drove 12 hours straight until they reached the U.S.-Canada border in Montana. Stewart instructed Sanford to stay quiet, and he was able to convince the Border Patrol agents that Sanford had been born in the U.S. and they were just visiting family. He had no paperwork to prove this, but Stewart was a clean-cut looking boy. He was 19 years old. He had a nice car. He had nice clothes, and he didn't seem dishonest, so they let him through.
Oh, boy.
Things were different back then. I don't think there were passports required or anything.
Right.
It was on this long drive that Sanford began to see glimmers of the true nature of his uncle. It confirmed everything that he felt about him. He noticed that he seemed to switch on and off quickly from being like normal, happy, to then being very agitated and quick-tempered. He would drone on and on with stories to Sanford with all of these details, and then he would just stop and look at Sanford and ask him to repeat back what he was saying. He wanted to make sure that Sanford was listening to him all the time.
Oh.
At one point, Sanford was having trouble staying awake, and when he didn't answer his uncle back correctly with the details, Stewart reached across the cab of the truck and punched Sanford very hard.
Aww.
He knew then that this was not going to be a good year for him.
No.
Their first stop when they got to Los Angeles was at his grandparents' house to see George and Louise. Sanford had not seen them in years, and he was excited to see his grandparents, but that quickly faded. Grandpa George seemed like a kind of shell of a human being now, and he just completely ignored Sanford. He was just existing. I saw some stuff, I think at some point in their relationship, like George had been the abusive one in the beginning, but then like Louise turned it around, and like George really became like her little minion, puppy. Things we've seen in other stories was happening between Louise and George at this point too. Louise was much more interested in doting on her darling boy Stewart, and she not only ignored Sanford for the most part of their visit, but when she did acknowledge him, it was in negative ways, usually yelling at him to complete chores and sometimes physically striking him. Sanford also mentions in his biography that he thought the relationship dynamic between Louise and Stewart was very strange. Once again, almost intimate.
Yeah.
And there were rumors, and it does come up at trial later, that Louise had an incestuous relationship with her own son, Stewart.
I see it.
This whole family, it is very Fred West-ish, and Rose too.
Yep.
Like these families. Keep your hands off your own children.
It has to be genetics. Like, why does it continue?
I mean, God tried to tell her not to have kids.
I know. And then the devil's like, I'll give you one.
Right. Interestingly enough, I'm going to take a tangent here. When I was researching this, I came across this. It was a witch site.
Oh.
And it talked about Louise, and it said that she, as a young child, had been taken to a ritual and a demon had been put inside of her. And they like go into all of this detail.
It's really interesting that you're saying that, because remember when I was like, when you started this, it felt like we were in the backwoods. Like when you were telling me the story in the beginning, I got really witchy vibes. Like there was something going on with this family. There's some kind of curse. Something's going on. So it's interesting that that is actually a possibility, because I feel that there's something supernatural in this family when you first started talking about it.
It would make sense when you see what all happened. So this website said that she was a lineage from some demon. It was put inside of her, and it was to be passed through her children. When Winnie was born, Winnie didn't get that. And so she kept having babies until Stewart, because it was odd that she didn't have this baby for 20 years.
Well, she got pregnant 4 other times after her firstborn son died.
Yes. So
I don't know.
There could be something
interesting. I got the vibe. You literally said nothing about witches, nothing about curses or anything, but I had the vibe in the very beginning. And it might be because 5 minutes after we started this, I'm like, we need candles, and I lit up the room. So
and
we're
it's so dark
in candlelight
because daylight savings. Now it gets dark at like 4:45.
It is dark.
So finally, after 2 weeks of being at his grandparents' house, Sanford was actually excited to hear that they would be leaving to go to the farm. He was ready for a change of pace, but he had no idea that his fate was even worse out east on the farm.
Because it would just be him and Stewart, right?
Yes, exactly. He and Stewart drove out to the farm, and Sanford quickly realized it wasn't a farm at all. It was just a plot of dirt. There was nothing on there.
Oh, no.
He and Stewart would sleep in a tent on a cot for a week until George could make time to come out and help build structures. He was a contractor and builder after all.
Right.
So he arrived and they would work to build a 1-bedroom shack of a house, a garage for Stewart's car, 6 chicken coops, rabbit hutches, goat houses, a hen run, and a grain house. It was a lot of work, specifically for Sanford and George, because Stewart didn't help much with the manual labor. He never had, and he wasn't ever expected to growing up. He liked to sit back and act like the manager instead, bossing them around on how to do things. If Sanford didn't do something exactly to Stewart's liking, he would begin beating the boy with his hands or any object that he could find lying around.
Oh.
George would witness it, but he did nothing. He was a weak man, and he was used to abuse, I guess, because he did it to his own children.
Right.
Once everything was built, George left, and it was then Sanford realized exactly how isolated he was. The nearest neighbor was acres away. There were no nearby kids to go visit, and there was no school out there for him to attend, as his uncle had promised. All he had now was Stewart.
Oh my God, how terrifying.
The night that George left to go back to the city, Stewart would immediately take advantage of that situation. He finally had a young boy all alone with no one around to stop him.
Oh, that's true.
Sanford went to bed after the long day of working on the farm. Shortly after, he heard his uncle come in to the room. He pretended to already be asleep so he didn't have to talk to him, but that didn't matter. Stewart had been waiting for this moment, and he slid into bed next to Sanford and proceeded to rape him. This would be the first time, but certainly not the last. In fact, from this point forward, Sanford said that his uncle would rape him 2 to 3 times per week, sometimes many more times. He described the pain as absolutely unbearable. His uncle would not only rape him in the conventional way, but also with various objects. He was often left bloodied after the encounters with Stewart, and this poor, trapped 13-year-old boy felt completely hopeless. On top of that, his daily routine on the farm was long. Sanford had to wake up at 5:30 a.m. to feed the animals and collect eggs. Once he was finished with his morning duties, he would come back inside to make breakfast, but he was never allowed to actually eat that breakfast. He had to give all the food to Stewart, and then any leftovers that Stewart didn't eat is what Sanford would get for his meals. Sometimes it would be nothing. After getting very little or maybe no food at all, he would have to go back to work on the farm, working for hours in the sun, making his hands bloodied and blistered. Sanford did all of the work on the farm while Stewart watched, making comments and punishing Sanford if he didn't do things exactly as told. And then at sunset, Sanford would go inside to make dinner, which once again was only for Stewart, and Sanford got the meager scraps that were left. Sanford was a slave in every way to Stewart. And after all of that, when he finally got to call it a night and get some sleep, he was always worried that tonight would be the night his uncle wanted to assault him again.
How absolutely horrible. You had a life before with your siblings, and your uncle shows up and takes you, and everything changes.
You're in hell.
You're in hell.
Literally. And there's no one to help you. He has no one to go to. And on top of all of this physical abuse, Stewart would mentally abuse Sanford, telling him that no one cared about him. And even if he ran away, the authorities would never believe the story that he would tell them. He also told him that homosexuality was illegal, and if he told the cops, they would put him in jail too. They would think he was a willing participant. Right. And, it's just this psychological abuse. He was like, you really like it. You enjoy this, and now you're complicit in it because you allowed me to do this to you. It's what these fuckers do to their victims. So Sanford became trapped in more ways than one. He was not only physically trapped there, he was mentally broken down, where even if he had the chance to escape, he probably would not have.
Yeah, I mean, acres away, you could run to your neighbor, but sometimes you question who decides to live out in the middle of nowhere, and maybe you're scared of them too.
Yeah. And then his uncle's telling him they're not going to believe you. You're going to go to jail. And he's 13.
And no one cares about you. I mean, it's easy that he would believe that. His mom was like, could care less.
Yes. And his grandparents didn't care. His own grandpa watched him get abused by Stewart, and his grandma hit him when he was there. Right. Really, the only person that Sanford had was his sister, Jessie.
Right. Yeah.
but he wasn't allowed to write letters to her without Stewart dictating them. And Stewart would dictate letters for Sanford to write to his mother and sister. In these letters, he would talk about how much he was learning from Uncle Stewart about how to run a farm and that he was doing so well in school. They would make up teacher names and they would say he had all these friends. He even talked of joining the Boy Scouts and how Stewart was hosting a camp for all the boys one night at the farm. Pure fiction.
Right.
And it must have been so degrading of a feeling to have to write those letters to his family, knowing how miserable his existence actually was.
Right. And his sister was like, write me, tell me what's happening. I'm going to come get you. That's his only chance to do that.
There's one story of him receiving a letter from his mother, and he told Stewart he would not write one back and continue to tell his family these lies. And when he refused to write the letter, Stewart dragged Sanford out into the chicken coop, chained his arms to a wooden board, and began to beat him mercilessly until he finally agreed that he would write another letter. This would actually start a new ritual for Stewart, as he found that he enjoyed tying Sanford up in the coop and beating him.
Oh, these sadistic people and their torturous ways.
One time, Sanford was beaten so badly that he passed out.
Yeah.
He recounts waking up and it was dark outside. It was the middle of the night and he realized that he had been left there and miraculously he was not chained up.
Oh.
This was his only chance to try and escape. So he began running towards the edge of the property in the dark. But as he got to the gate, he began doubting himself, remembering all the horrible things his uncle had said about going to jail and no one believing him. And he realized he had nowhere to go even if he got off the property. Where was he going to go? Who was he going to talk to? So he gave up and he went back to the house and crawled into bed and drifted off to sleep. But he was awakened suddenly by a scorching pain as Stewart threw a pot of boiling water on him. His uncle had been watching him the whole time and had seen him running, and he punished him for even thinking of leaving the farm.
Horrible.
Sanford was in an unbearable amount of pain after being burned badly, and he was slipping in and out of consciousness over the next few hours and even into days. He finally woke up and was cognizant, and he realized that he had been placed inside of a wooden box about the size of a coffin.
Oh my God.
There were a few holes so he could breathe, but he couldn't move. It was apparent that his Uncle Stewart wanted to make him pay for trying to escape, and he knew while lying there trapped in that coffin-like box that he would never try to escape his uncle again.
This is so crazy. I mean, does he think that his sister's literally never going to come down and see her son?
She never does. I don't think she was a good mother.
Yeah.
Obviously.
I know.
So Sanford had accepted his fate. He was broken completely, and he kind of learned how to navigate his Uncle Stewart's moods, and he realized if he just made sure his uncle always felt like he was in control of everything, life would be easier for him. He didn't scream anymore during punishments. He realized how much his uncle enjoyed that kind of behavior, and he didn't want to give him more pleasure.
Right. Yeah.
And this actually worked for him in a way because it caused Stewart to begin losing interest in Sanford in a sexual way.
Okay.
Also, Sanford was beginning to age.
Right.
He was now 14 and he was starting to look more like a man. He was hitting puberty. He was getting more body hair. He was getting a deeper voice. And that's not what Stewart was attracted to.
Ugh.
Stewart had to continue to fulfill that need, and he began to leave the farm more and more. And he would tell Sanford specifically that he was going out to find, quote, fresh meat.
Okay.
Sanford knew that although his life was easier, which he was grateful for at this point, he was being raped less and less frequently, but he knew it only meant that other boys nearby were probably suffering the wrath of his Uncle Stewart.
Who is only, 20?
20.
That's
at this
crazy.
Point. It's fucked up. And then his uncle began showing back up to the farm with boys, mostly Mexican boys that did not speak much English.
Oh.
Stewart would take the boys out to the chicken coop and chain them up, sexually abusing them, sometimes for weeks on end.
Oh my God.
Sanford would hear the boys screaming in Spanish at night, asking for help.
Oh my God.
Sanford would lie in his bed inside the house crying because he knew there was nothing he could do to help these poor boys. And he also knew exactly what kind of torture they were being subjected to. Then it would go quiet, and Sanford knew that the boys were no longer in the chicken coop. What happened to them isn't fully known. Did he take them back to town and drop them off on the side of the road? Or was it here that he began killing the boys and disposing of their bodies? Sanford wasn't sure at this point, but he does recall that there were many that came to the farm in these months.
Wow. Those poor boys, to be in a different country and you can't even speak the language and you're subjected to this. How scary. How scary.
All child victims, like their last moments on this earth are just pure terror.
I hope that there's something beautiful like in The Lovely Bones, that movie.
I know.
Where she finds that tree and all the victims.
That movie, really was good in many ways, but also just so hard to watch.
Yeah.
I also read the book, and it always comes up to me with child cases as well. But then his worst fears about his uncle did come true. He was escalating. On February 22nd of 1928, Stewart came home that day seeming almost giddy. Sanford knew to be on guard and worried when his uncle acted this way. He rarely smiled, and so he knew it was probably something sick and twisted.
Right.
Stewart pulled a bucket out of his car and handed it to Sanford. When Sanford looked inside, it appeared to be a dead animal. It was bloodied with matted hair, and there was brain tissue leaking out. But as he took a closer look, he was absolutely horrified to see that it was not an animal at all, but rather the head of a young boy.
Oh my God.
Sanford set down the bucket and began to retch. He wanted to vomit. His uncle began laughing at him in a maniacal way. He told Sanford that he shouldn't be worried. He had only killed the boy in self-defense.
Oh my God.
But Sanford knew better than to believe his uncle. He told Sanford that he had left the rest of the boy on the side of the road, and he had only taken his head with him so the authorities could not identify the boy. That afternoon, Stewart forced Sanford to help him dispose of the boy's head. They started a big bonfire. Stewart watched gleefully while Sanford felt absolutely disgusted and terrified. He was in charge of keeping the fire going, and he said it took hours and hours for the head to burn. Even with all the tissue matter finally burning away, it was still very evident that a human skull was laying in their fire. Stewart then told Sanford he needed to break it up using a fence post. He said he felt disgusted at his own actions, but also knew he had no other choice but to follow his uncle's orders.
Right.
He was now truly afraid that his uncle would in fact kill him if he didn't stay in line.
Yeah, he's psycho.
It's an impossible situation for Sanford. The next morning, a farmer was walking his dog in the city of Puente when suddenly the dog took off to a ditch where they found the body of a headless boy. The LA sheriff responded to the call, finding a naked boy's body estimated to be around the age of 16 years old. He had been killed by a .22 caliber bullet to his chest, and the decapitation had happened post-mortem.
Okay, well, at least there's that.
Sadly, this boy would never be identified, and to this day is still referred to as simply the headless Mexican boy.
Yeah.
I'm sure he was from Mexico and his family didn't know whatever happened to him. It's really, really sad.
It's crazy. This is the 1920s and it's California.
California is where it all is.
What is going on? And maybe there is like
some demon possession going on there.
Right.
Once word reached Stewart that the LAPD was looking for information about this boy's killer, he decided it was time to take a trip to visit his parents again, and he took Sanford with him. Along the drive to Highland Ranch, they would toss pieces of the boy's pulverized skull out the window along the side of the road. All evidence was now gone that would point to Stewart as the killer.
Okay.
When they arrived at George and Louise's house, Sanford mentions how once again Louise was fawning all over her darling boy Stewart. He told both of his parents that he needed to get away from the farm because he had hired a young Mexican boy to come work with him, and then he caught him stealing. He said that when he confronted the boy pulled out a knife, and Stewart reacted in self-defense of him and Sanford, and he killed this Mexican boy.
Okay. I mean, why even mention it?
Because he's a pathological liar.
He just wants to get his mother's approval of him killing a boy.
Yeah, if it came up, I think is what it was.
Okay.
Sanford recalled watching his grandparents react as Stewart spun this tale, and he could tell that his grandpa George did not believe one word coming out of his mouth. But Louise, on the other hand, hugged her boy and consoled him, telling him how awful it must have been, and she was so glad he was brave enough to kill that boy. Louise and Stewart then went off to the movies together, giggling like young lovers, leaving Sanford at home with George. He thought about telling his grandpa what really happened, but he also realized it didn't matter.
He wasn't going to do anything.
George wasn't going to do anything, and his grandparents would support their son no matter what. So they were not going to be an ally for him.
It would be in those times that I would try and write a real letter.
Or try to run away.
Well, I know,
or go to the LAPD, or...
It seems like anytime he's had an opportunity to run away, he believes that he's worthless or has nobody that could help him. But
you're right. He could have tried.
He could have tried writing Jessie. I mean, it's not like she would be able to write him back. But anyway, I don't know. I feel like there would have been opportunities to tell the truth to her, maybe.
But he also knows anything he writes is going to go to his mom first, and Winnie's going to cover for Stewart. So there is that dynamic. Just like Louise is in love with Stewart, his mom, Winnie, is in love with Stewart. So
what the fuck?
I do not know. Has to be demon possession. So just 1 month later, after this little boy was found killed on the side of the road, we come to the most well-known victim of Stewart Northcott, and that is Walter Collins. And this is another story in itself, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about Walter. So Walter Collins Jr. was born on September 23rd, 1918, to Walter Joseph Sr. and Christine Collins. At some point between his birth and being 9 years old, his father was sent to Folsom State Prison on a conviction of robbery, and that left his mother, Christine, as a single mother that had to try and make ends meet for the two of them. It was not common for women to be in the workplace back in the 1920s. Most women were housewives, but she didn't really have a choice.
Right.
And she found work as a telephone operator.
Okay.
This meant she was gone quite often, and she could not afford childcare, so Walter would often be left home alone, and he would be like checked on by the neighbors. They lived in Lincoln Heights. He was young. He was 9 years old, but it also wasn't as uncommon back then for kids of that young age to spend some time at home, time alone.
Right.
Yeah.
We see old movies of just the kids in the woods. They're all alone all day long. Now I see a 14-year-old on the side of the road. I'm like, what are you doing alone?
I was so afraid to leave my kids alone, even when they were like, please go, Mom. I still am now. I'm like, are you home? How's it going?
Yeah.
One of my kids doesn't even live with me, and I worry all the time.
Right.
On March 10th of 1928, Christine had a shift to work, and she was leaving Walter at home alone, as she had many times before. He asked if he could go see a movie and walk to the theater alone to get out of the house while his mom was away. She gave him a dime for the show and kissed him goodbye. She did not know this would be the last time she would see her beloved little boy.
Aww.
Walter was last seen by a neighbor at the corner of Pasadena Avenue and North Avenue 23 in Lincoln Heights, Los Angeles, around 5 p.m. that day, which was about 2 blocks from his house. He was wearing a brown, red, and black lumber jacket, brown pants, black Oxfords, and a gray hat. He was walking in the direction of the movie theater, but Walter would never make it there. It is not real clear exactly how Walter was abducted, but based on how Stewart picked up other victims, it is believed that he saw Walter walking alone and offered him a ride, perhaps convincing him to get in the car with him on the promise of taking him to his farm to ride ponies. We will find out later that this is one of his stories, was, I've got ponies. It's right down the road. I'll take you.
Or you're going to the movies. I have candy. I'll just give you a quick ride.
I also have to bring up that Walter used to come into the grocery store where Stewart worked quite often to pick up his mother's grocery orders, so he may have recognized Stewart.
That's true.
And he thought he was a safe person to get in the car with.
Right.
Later that night, Christine would return home from her shift expecting to see little Walter sitting in the living room as normal, but the house was quiet. She called for him, but there was no answer, and she quickly realized that he was not in the home. At first, she just thought he must be outside playing with neighborhood friends, but she found out that he was not with anyone, and that's when she became worried. She called the police and reported that her son was missing, but they did not treat her report with any urgency. They gave her the typical response of, just go home and wait it out. I'm sure he'll turn up soon. He's probably just out having fun. He's a boy after all. But Christine knew her son well. He was a good boy, and he would never cause her to worry like that, not knowing where he was. She knew, and mothers always have that intuition. She knew something terrible must have happened.
If only these people would trust a mother's intuition.
The way that they treated Christine is absolutely unacceptable. What Christine didn't know is that the cops were already working on the decapitated young boy case that they had found on the road just 1 month before. And there was also a young girl that had been kidnapped and killed while walking to school. And so they didn't need another missing kid on their docket. So there's a lot of politics going on with LAPD with this case as well.
Okay, but if a body shows up, then you're going to look bad.
I know.
So why are you not taking it seriously?
The LAPD at this time was under fire for several corruption scandals, and the fact that all of these kids started going missing was particularly embarrassing for them. The chief at the time, James Davis, was under intense pressure to solve these cases. Because of this, police had to look like they were doing something, so they did search the Lincoln Park Lake near his house, thinking that perhaps Walter had just wandered off and drowned, but they didn't find anything.
Okay.
Walter's father suspected that maybe former inmates at Folsom Prison could have killed or kidnapped his boy for revenge. He was a prison mess hall boss, and he was responsible for reporting other inmates' infractions in the cafeteria. So he got involved. There were dozens of tips that came in, but they didn't lead anywhere.
Okay.
They turned up no trace of Walter Collins for over 5 months. And then one day in August, a boy appeared in DeKalb, Illinois, claiming to be Walter Collins.
What?
This is what the whole movie Changeling is about.
Oh, okay. I really don't remember it. I just remember watching it at some point.
I would recommend. It's a hard watch, but it's a good one. Christine Collins was so excited to hear that her darling boy had been found, and she paid for his transportation from Illinois back to California. But when the boy arrived, although he did bear a resemblance to her son, she knew immediately it was not Walter.
Right.
Despite Christine insisting that this is not my son, the Los Angeles Police Department, because they were under so much scrutiny, they had brought in like TV reporters to video and photograph the moment. They didn't want to look even worse. So they were like, no, this is your son. It's just that he's been through so much in the last 5 months. You don't recognize him.
Okay.
And they told her to take him home and, quote, try him out.
Oh my God.
Fucked up.
I know. Just think about it. Like me thinking of my own daughter.
We know our kids.
Okay.
Christine,
how terrible for her.
Yeah, she felt like she was put in this impossible place. She was exhausted from protesting, and so she consented, and she took this boy home.
Well, and it is a little boy.
It's a little boy. He's 9, you know.
It's not like he was like
a man or something.
Yeah,
Take this man home.
He still needs cared for, and they gave him to her. So what is she going to do?
She knew this was not her son, and she even brought like neighbors over, and like he didn't know where things were in the house. He didn't know which room was his. Like there were very clear signs. But she kept this little boy in her house for 3 weeks.
Okay.
But after that, she'd had enough. She knew this was not her son. She was telling over these 3 weeks, she kept calling the police. They were ignoring her. They were treating her like she was insane.
Wow. Okay.
She went to the police captain, Jones, who I already said was corrupt, and she said, this is not him. And as proof, she brought dental records that showed her son Walter had several fillings, and this boy didn't have the same ones.
I mean, this poor boy, too. He's like, what the fuck am I doing here?
Well, he had told them he was Walter Collins. And we'll talk about him, like what was his motive, right?
Okay.
He was pretending the whole time. If you watch the movie, this boy, and he was in real life, he was saying like, no, Mom, it's Walter.
Oh, creepy.
So I can't go into all the details. Just watch the movie.
I'll watch the movie.
This case is wild.
Right. I'll stop asking questions.
In spite of the evidence, Captain Jones, rather than face more negative publicity, he didn't want to have to say, oh, nope, wrong boy. He refused to take her insistence that this boy was not hers, even with the dental records. And instead, he committed Christine Collins to the Los Angeles County General Hospital's psychiatric ward.
Oh, my God.
Under Code 12 internment, which is a code to commit someone who is deemed difficult or an inconvenience. He just locked her away because he didn't want to look bad. This woman whose son had gone missing.
That's fucked up. Did we hear this in another, like this is ringing a bell to me, or maybe I'm just remembering the movie. This is weird.
I've never heard something like this before, but it's it's scary.
Yeah.
That the police had that kind of power. I hope to God they don't have that power today.
Oh, I'm sure they do it in some ways.
So Christine Collins was committed to this hospital psych ward, and she was kept there for 10 days. And the only thing that got her out was during that time, the boy that had been living at her house finally admitted to not being Walter Collins.
Okay.
This boy was actually named Arthur Hutchins Jr. He was 12 years old. He wasn't even 9. He was from Iowa, and he was running away from his unhappy home life.
Yeah.
While he was at a restaurant, somebody mentioned that he looked like the boy in the news, Walter Collins, and he decided that was his ticket, and he posed as the missing boy because it was an attempt to get a free trip from Iowa to California.
Okay, well, it worked.
Yes, it did for him. Once the truth came out, they did release Christine Collins from the psych ward. She filed a false imprisonment case against the city, which she damn well should have.
Yeah.
She won the lawsuit,
Good.
And Captain Jones was personally ordered to pay $10,800 to Christine. She planned to use those funds to continue her search for her son, who was obviously still missing.
Yeah.
Sadly, she would never see $1 of that money. He never paid it. Eventually, the police would connect the disappearance of Walter Collins to Stewart Northcott, and this would be due to the testimony of Sanford Clark, because he remembers quite vividly what happened to Walter.
Oh, okay.
So we'll go back to that date, March 10th of 1928. Sanford was on the farm alone, reading a book in his room when he heard his uncle's car pull up. Shortly after, he heard Stewart talking, and then it was followed by the voice of a young boy. But it was different this time. The boy was speaking clear English instead of Spanish. When Sanford walked out of the house, he saw 9-year-old Walter Collins standing next to his uncle. Walter was at the chicken farm, and his fate would be much the same as the other boys who had been brought there before. He He was thrown into the chicken coop and chained. Sanford heard the screams that night and felt absolutely helpless and horrified that there was nothing he could do. The next morning, while he was out doing his chores and Stewart was sleeping, he walked over to the chicken coop and whispered through the door to Walter. He said, "Hey, just do whatever he says, okay? It will be easier that way for you." As the boys before had always been Mexican and couldn't speak English, he would hear their cries for help but not really understand what they were saying, and he had no way to communicate with them. With Walter, he understood every single word, and it affected him even more.
Yeah.
He saw his uncle as a true monster at this point.
I know he's been through so much himself, but it makes me think of the Stainer boy.
Yeah.
He was abducted and he was the focus of everything until he got too old and he brought another little boy in, and that was what changed everything for him. He knew he had to save that little boy.
Yeah. A couple days into Walter's captivity, Stewart ordered Sanford to go inside the chicken coop and line the walls with feed. He knew this was most likely to help muffle the sounds coming from the boy inside. He also told Sanford to take Walter and get him washed up in the well. As Sanford was walking with Walter, he looked over and noticed how frail the boy was and how he was covered in deep bruises and dried blood all over his body.
Poor baby.
They said nothing to each other as they walked over to the well, and Sanford drew a bucket of water for Walter to use. He turned away to give the boy privacy while washing up, and this is when Walter said to him, "Can you please tell him I am sorry so he will just stop?" And then he began crying. Sanford answered, "That's not going to help. I wish there was something I could do to help you, but I can't. You just have to listen to every single thing he says, and if you don't, things will get a lot worse for you. Don't argue with him, don't talk back, and never beg." The following morning on March 12th, Grandma Louise showed up at the farm. Sanford had no idea she was coming for a visit, but now it made sense why Stewart had asked him to pad the chicken coop and wash Walter up to make him look less disheveled. Sanford had hoped for the first time that there is no way his grandma would look past this if she discovered little Walter out chained in the chicken coop.
Yeah.
Louise would end up staying at the farm for about a week.
Wow. Okay.
She didn't seem to know anything was amiss for the first couple of nights. Stewart would slip out to the chicken coop after she fell asleep, but she must have seen him coming back in on the third night, and she thought it was odd. The next morning, she got up early and went to the chicken coop. Sanford recalls sitting at the breakfast table when Louise came into the house screaming at the top of her lungs.
Oh, boy.
"You filthy bastard, I've watched you sneak away to the chicken coop multiple times while I've been here. Why do you have a little boy in there?" Stewart acted dumb like he had no idea what she had just seen with her own eyes, so she continued, "I thought you were done with this kind of stuff."
Oh, no.
Sanford watched from the corner and realized that Louise and her son seemed to have had this conversation before. But it does seem she had never realized how depraved her son actually was. Seeing a young boy chained up was much more serious. After a few minutes of fighting, Stewart broke down and admitted to his mother that he abducted the boy. He said, "I'm sorry, Mama. I lost control. I never meant to hurt the boy. I need your help, please. Mama, I love you.
Oh, my God.
Help me." Sanford felt relief for the first time ever. His grandma would have to help now. There's no way she could excuse this kind of behavior from her son. But he was wrong. He watched as his grandma softened, knelt down next to her son, Stewart, and told him she had a plan.
Oh my God, she's going to help? Ugh.
She said, "Here's what we're going to do. The quickest and quietest way to kill the boy is with an axe.
Oh my God.
All three of us are going to strike him so that none of us can ever talk about this again. Do you understand?" Mm-hmm. Sanford could not believe what he was hearing. Not only was his grandmother suggesting they kill a 9-year-old boy, but they were going to make him participate. She said that she would deliver the first axe blow and deliver Walter into the arms of the Lord, because she had some kind of religious something. Then they would all take turns striking Walter, so they were equally responsible. That night, Louise grabbed the axe and told them to follow her to the chicken coop. Inside the coop, Walter was fast asleep on a tiny cot.
Oh my God.
Louise wasted no time. She approached Walter with the axe, raised it up, and slammed it down onto his head. Louise would end up delivering 2 more blows with the axe before turning around and handing it to Sanford. Sanford was in shock. He was almost to the point of vomiting again. He was gagging and retching because he just saw that happen.
Yeah.
But his uncle shoved him back into the coop. He was trying to back away, and both Louise and Stewart began to threaten him. If he didn't deliver a blow to Walter, he would be the next to die. He knew they meant it, and that if he didn't participate, they would kill him. They were evil. So he grabbed the axe from his grandma's hand, raised it up high, and came down on Walter. He said the only thing that made him feel a little better is knowing that Walter was already dead.
Okay. All right.
And then he said he looked over to his uncle afterwards and he could see pleasure in Stewart's eyes. And Stewart said, "I can trust you now, Sanford. You're really part of the family."
Oh my gosh.
And then Stewart excitedly grabbed the axe from Sanford and began hacking at Walter's little body.
Oh.
Sanford would be haunted by this for the rest of his life. He would never forget the sound of that first blow his grandma delivered to Walter. He said the only comfort he felt was knowing that the torture was finally over for little Walter. At least Stewart couldn't hurt him anymore. After this, Stewart forced Sanford to dig a grave in the chicken coop, and that is where they would keep Walter's body until further notice. It is believed that Walter died on March 16th, approximately 7 days after he was abducted by Stewart.
Oh, you don't even know what to say.
Sometimes when we're telling these really dark stories, it's like I'm just trying to get the facts out there.
Right.
But know that like it's hard to read this stuff.
Really?
And I've been immersed in this case, obviously. So
right.
I've worked through the feelings already. But even reading this, like I feel it. It's just evil.
There's a point where you become a little bit numb while you're writing it up and whatnot. And I haven't had a chance to react to something like this in a while. It's just heartbreaking to put yourself in the shoes of a little child who is being taken out in this way. It's the worst kind of evil there is.
Fortunately, he was asleep, so he never saw it coming.
I hope he didn't feel anything.
Right. That's all we can hope. What's maddening is that we know Walter was killed 7 days after he was abducted. And I just talked about all this other stuff Christine was going through as the mom and months and months. And this whole time, her little boy was already gone.
Right. That's crazy. It's horrible.
So now we're going to skip ahead 2 months. Since Walter was killed on the farm, Stewart was getting that urge to kill again. He couldn't control it. And on the evening of May 26th, 1928, Sanford would watch his uncle hop into his car in a gleeful mood heading towards town. He knew what that meant. In the nearby town of Pomona, two brothers were asking their mother for permission to get out of the house for the evening. It was 12-year-old Louis and 10-year-old Nelson Winslow. They'd asked their mom if they could walk to the Model Yacht Club. It's a nearby boys' organization that would build and sell little models of yachts and airplanes. Their mom was a little uneasy about letting them go, but she was sick that night and she was just tired and she knew she couldn't entertain them. And the club was only 2 blocks from their house. So after persistent begging from the boys, she agreed as long as they would come back within the hour.
Okay.
What their mom didn't know is that this is an area that Stewart would frequent. He knew of the club and he had been watching it and knew that boys might be walking back and forth unchaperoned by their parents.
Okay.
The Winslow brothers showed up at the club and ended up having so much fun building airplanes and yachts that they lost track of time. They realized it was now 8:30 p.m. and their mother would not be happy with them being so late. So they rushed out for their walk home, but they never arrived back to their mother. Somewhere in those 2 blocks, they were approached by Stewart, and he somehow convinced them to get into his car.
2 of them this time.
2 of them. That night, Sanford heard his uncle's car pull up into the driveway and stepped outside expecting to see another young boy victim, but he was shocked when he saw not 1 but 2 young boys. Stewart grabbed their arms and began dragging them to the chicken coop, and once they were chained up, he told Sanford to hide their belongings in the garage. The next morning, Sanford went to check on the brothers. He brought them food and found them cowering and bloodied in the chicken coop. He gave them advice just as he had done with Walter before. Don't argue, do what he says, don't beg. The Winslow brothers would be kept in the chicken coop for nearly a week, and every single day Stewart would spend several hours in there. Sanford would hear the screams. But Stewart also knew that he was playing with fire on this one. The 2 boys came from a very wealthy family that had the resources to look for them. Christine didn't have that.
Okay.
And Walter Collins was also still in the news, and the LAPD had quite the pressure on them now that 3 boys were missing on their watch. So Stewart thought to get ahead of it by forcing the brothers to write letters home to their parents. He made them write the following: Dear Mother and Dad, we are going to Mexico to make a lot of money making yachts and airplanes. A woman gave us something to eat. Don't worry. We will be okay. Louie and Nelson.
Okay.
What parent would believe that shit?
No.
Hey, Mom, Dad, we're just going to go to Mexico. It's going to be fine.
I'm 10. He's 12. We're good. Okay.
And then Stewart began talking to Sanford about his paranoia of the boys being found. He also told Sanford that they were a little too old for him and he was tiring of them quickly. He started talking about the possibility of letting them go, but only if he could be fully convinced that they would not open their mouths about what happened to them on the farm. Sanford offered to help. He was excited that maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't be forced to engage in another despicable act.
Right.
So Stewart tells him that they should talk to the brothers one at a time in the house and let them know of the plan. So he sends Sanford to the chicken coop to get the older brother Louis and walk him back to the house. He's talking to Louis along the way and he said, we're going to go talk to my uncle when we get in there, like do this, do that. And I think my uncle will actually let you leave. He said Lewis's eyes filled with tears and even thanked Sanford for trying to help.
Oh.
When Sanford and Lewis stepped inside of the house, Sanford didn't see his uncle sitting there waiting to talk at the kitchen table. He told Lewis to take a seat and he would go find where his uncle had gone. He quickly realized that he had been a pawn in a completely different plan.
To get them separated?
Yes. His uncle was already out in the chicken coop with Nelson.
Aww.
He walked in just in time to see his uncle bringing the axe down on Nelson's head.
Oh my God.
His uncle had made up the story of letting them go so Sanford would help separate the boys, making it easier to kill them. Sanford opened his mouth about to scream at the sight of what his uncle was doing, but Stewart immediately grabbed him, covering his mouth, and told him if he made one sound, he would be killed too. He explained that he needed Lewis to remain calm inside of the house while they took care of Nelson's now dead body. He ordered Sanford to drag Nelson out to the hen house and bury him in a shallow grave. As Sanford lifted Nelson up by his arms to drag him that way, he realized that the boy was not yet dead.
Oh my gosh.
Nelson was moaning all the way out to the hen house, and Sanford said once again the sounds of that haunt him for the rest of his life. Stewart followed to help put the body into the grave, and once they placed him in there, the boy began moaning louder and louder. Stewart was afraid that his brother Lewis would hear what was going on, and so he told Sanford to throw dirt on his head first.
Oh my gosh.
So they buried Nelson while he was still alive. And now Stewart told Sanford the next part of his plan, which was everything Sanford feared would happen. He told Sanford that he was going to get Lewis from the house, bring him back out into the chicken coop. He would distract Lewis and keep him looking in his direction, while Sanford was to sneak up from behind and strike Lewis with the axe. Sanford protested and told his uncle he would not do it. He wasn't going to kill for him. But then, of course, his uncle said, if you don't do it, I'll just throw you in the grave with them. So he felt like he must comply with this sick plan. And so they did exactly as planned. Sanford came up from behind Lewis and struck him down with the axe. They then placed his body in the same shallow grave with his brothers. Sanford was beside himself at this point. He had now helped his uncle kill 3 boys on the farm, and he feared he would just be expected to continue.
It's something like that I would question my own existence. What's my life even worth if I'm going to continue helping with this? And why does it matter? I mean, get rid of me too.
And it does talk about this. His mental state went really downhill. There were plenty of times he was like, just kill me. He contemplated suicide.
Yeah.
It's going to be a good thing that Sanford survives because he's a witness.
Right.
So there's reason for it.
Poor boys, poor family, losing both of their children.
I can't fucking imagine.
In this way. Wow.
On May 28th, Stewart had Sanford write 2 more letters, one to send to the Winslows and another to send to his own parents. They had to keep up pretenses that all was well. The letter sent to the Winslow boys' parents read, Dear Mother and Dad, we are well and having a wonderful adventure. Our only trouble is in getting something to eat. We travel at night and sleep in barns during the day. Is our name in the papers yet? If we can get far enough away and stay hid enough, we will be as famous as Lindbergh. Please do not show anyone this letter. Do not worry. We will be all right. Love from Lewis and Nelson.
Oh my gosh. Like, that's not going to do anything.
No,
why even do that?
For that? I know.
Like, what's the
because
purpose?
He's deranged and he's also only 20 years old. He's not.
It's so hard to remember that sometimes.
Which makes it even worse. That
it's
he's
worse.
This sick at 20. Can you imagine what he's going to be like in another 20 years? Like, get this guy off the streets.
He can't be allowed to live.
And the letter he had Sanford send to his own family read, Dear Jesse and Dad, here's your confidential letter to just the pair of you, such as you have requested. Don't tell Mom. Ha ha. Sorry it took so long to write you back, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to play this game or not. Your confidential letters sure do cheer me up, and you can bet your life that I never let anyone else see them. Ha ha. You will just have to trust me on that. I hope that you will keep writing to me, and also that you will understand that Uncle Stewart is taking very good care of me, and that it's hard for me to get the chance to write very often because of my many projects. Of course, Uncle Stewart does all of the heaviest work, but I still have lots of little chores to do all over the ranch. He is teaching me all about being a rancher. You would be surprised to see how much skill Uncle Stewart has when it comes to dealing with the other ranchers around here and the merchants in town. Because of this example, I could do all of this myself someday. And of course, that is besides what I am learning in school, which is fine. Your darling boy, just kidding, Sanford. When Sanford's sister Jessie read this letter, she immediately knew something was off.
Good.
It didn't sound like her brother. He was using words and saying things in ways that he would have never. Additionally, Sanford had now been gone from Canada for 2 years.
Wow.
But his handwriting still looked the same, and if he had really been going to school, it should have improved. Right. Jessie read the letter, and she told her mom, Winnie, of her concerns, but of course, Winnie shut anything down. Her little brother could do no wrong in her eyes. So Jessie decided it was time to take matters into her own hands.
Because now she would have been like 18.
She's 18, yeah.
Right? Okay.
She is 18 now. So she was going to take a trip to see what was really going on for herself. And so she began saving all of her money from work for traveling to California.
Good sister.
But it would take her a couple of months to get enough money. But by late July, she was on her way.
Okay.
Between May and August, when all of this was going on, Jesse's getting money, Stewart did attempt to add more victims to his list. He knew he was playing with fire, but he really just couldn't help himself. One bizarre tale was he tried to abduct an entire family. They were called the Dolls.
Dolls?
The Dolls, D-A-H-L-S.
Okay.
He met them working at the Salvation Army, although let's be honest, he wasn't working there out of the kindness of his heart. He was probably trolling for victims.
Right.
Once again, he did this with the help of his mother, Louise. At this time, he was using an alias, Mr. Craig, and Louise was his aunt, Mrs. Mayo.
So they were working together?
Yes.
So at some point, she's like, all right, if you're going to keep this up, you have to do it with my help. That's the only way I'll let you keep doing this.
Because she was protecting her son. So she's deranged and crazy. The Doll family had 4 young sons. They were ages 8 through 15, and they were on hard times because the father had just lost his job. Stewart offered to let them all come live on his farm for free in exchange for the labor of their sons. But they weren't just going to move out there. They were like, well, let us come see this farm and check it out. And they were like, this is a very kind offer. Thank you. He brought them out in his car with his mom. And his intention was to kill both of the parents at that time and capture the 4 boys in his chicken coop. It was a dream for him.
Right.
Stewart pulled Louise and Sanford aside while the family was out there walking the farm, and he told them of his plan. And this was the one time that Sanford really put his foot down and pushed back. He said, I am not going to help destroy a whole family for you.
Yeah.
And he also told him, you're insane if you think you're going to get away with this. You will definitely get caught and go to jail. And Sanford saying that seemed to be what triggered. It wasn't about not killing a whole family. Okay. Louise also agreed when Sanford brought it up. Louise said it was a dangerous plan, but she also agreed that she would help Stewart. Shockingly, Stewart listened to Sanford that day and he drove the family back. If it wasn't for Sanford being on the farm that day, it could have taken a much darker turn.
Yeah.
Stewart was becoming more paranoid as the papers continued to publish details about the missing Winslow brothers and Walter Collins. Sanford recalled his uncle having him dig up the remains of Walter Collins and both of the brothers, and then Stewart put them into his car and drove off into the desert. He didn't want there to be any evidence in the event that the cops ended up finding their way to his farm.
Okay.
And then Jessie finally shows up. It took her a couple of weeks because she was traveling the cheapest way, which was by boat from Vancouver to California.
Oh, okay.
She showed up at the farm, and it was a very happy reunion for her to see her little brother. They both embraced. But Jessie had shown up expecting to see an almost grown man now. Her brother had left when he was 13 and now he was 15. And usually around that time, brothers would start surpassing their little sisters in height. But she was absolutely shocked when she saw Sanford. He was extremely thin and malnourished, looking far worse now than when he left their childhood home, and he hadn't grown any. She also noticed her Uncle Stewart was not happy to see her there. In fact, he was annoyed. While she wanted to talk to her little brother and catch up, she was never allowed to be alone with Sanford. Stewart was always hovering. She wanted to ask her brother so many questions. She clearly knew something was wrong. And so on the second night of her stay, she waited until Stewart had fallen asleep, and then she crawled into bed with her brother, pulled the covers over both of their heads, and whispered to Sanford, "What's going on here? Yeah. I'm so sorry. Things have been rough for you. I figured it would be bad, but this is absolutely horrible." And it was in this moment Sanford finally broke and told her that she had no idea how bad it had been, the things he had seen and been forced to do. He told her everything that had happened to him, from the beginning abuse, the boiled water being spilled on him. He told her he hadn't been to school. He even finally admitted through tears that he had been sexually abused by his uncle. He seemed so ashamed of this.
Yeah.
Jessie couldn't believe what she was hearing, and yet Sanford continued. He then told her that Uncle Stewart was a monster and that he kills boys and had made Sanford help. And then he told her, the most shocking detail of all, that their grandma Louise had been involved. I don't even know how you take this in.
And grandma kills too.
And she's just like, what? Jessie just hugged her brother closely and held him. She had no idea what to say, but she knew she had to get him out of the situation and fast.
Right.
But she also knew it was dangerous.
Dangerous. Yeah.
She told him she would do everything she possibly could and that this nightmare would be over soon.
Because for all you know, he could kill her.
Exactly.
Just to stop this from happening.
She told him they had to pretend like nothing was different when they were around Stewart for the next few days. The only people Jessie knew in the U.S. were her grandparents, and Sanford had just told her that Louise was involved. So she decided to go to her grandpa when Louise was not around.
Well, maybe he'll listen to a girl.
She had no money, but wanted to see if she could get his help to purchase 2 bus tickets back to Canada. She told George everything that Sanford had told her, and he began to weep. He told her that he knew things like this had been going on, but he was such a weak man, and he told her the only thing he could do to help was give her the money for the bus tickets.
Okay, well.
At least he did that.
Yeah.
On the morning they were set to leave, Stewart somehow seemed to be aware something was afoot. And when George showed up to come and pick up Sanford under some other guise, Stewart would not let him leave. Jessie got on the bus alone and headed back to Canada. She had no choice. As soon as she arrived in Canada, she immediately went to the American consulate in Vancouver and told them her little brother had been illegally brought into the States by her murderous uncle, and now his life was in danger.
Oh, smart.
Fortunately, they took her seriously, and on August 30th of 1928, Detective Lieutenant Chester Lloyd of the LAPD received a telegram about the alleged child murderer living in Wineville.
Okay, good.
While all of this was going on, Stewart knew it was bad news that Jessie left the farm, like she did, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the authorities would show up. So he called Mama, and they also had Sanford dig up all the graves, anything that was left. They began looking for any evidence that might be incriminating and found ways to destroy it.
Okay.
Stewart had a fire sale on everything he owned to gain money for traveling. He told the neighbors and the townspeople that stopped by that his 17-year-old wife had left him and he was beside himself and just needed to move. And with that money, he and Mama Louise packed all of their belongings into Stewart's car and they were off on the run. They left Sanford at the farm with no furniture, no food, and no way to really get out of the situation. But honestly, Sanford said he was just happy to be alive. He was afraid they would kill him after his sister left.
So son and mom ran off together like Bonnie and Clyde?
Exactly.
What the fuck?
The story is like too crazy to be believed.
It's like House of a Thousand Corpses type of family.
This is a horror
scenario.
movie that you don't think could actually happen. Like, truth is so much crazier than fiction.
I know, right?
So he just hung out at the house. He knew his sister was probably working on something and he was happy to be alone and he just waited.
Okay.
And on August 31st of 1928, Sanford watched as a car pulled into the driveway and realized it was the authorities. Then, like, something in the back of his mind made him scared.
Oh, yeah, of course.
The voice of his uncle resounded, saying he was guilty too. He had murdered those boys. He was going to go to jail. And so he ran and hid in the chicken coop, and he locked it behind him. When the officers got to the chicken coop and found it locked, they broke down the door, and it was completely dark inside. As they shined their flashlights around, they found a boy cowering in the corner. He looked very
emaciated, dirty. He looked like a victim.
He was shaking with fear, and they guessed his age to be around 12.
Oh, wow.
He's 15.
Okay.
Sanford began sobbing and begging them not to take him to jail, but they assured him he was safe now. Whatever had happened to him was over. Sanford Clark was in really bad shape from the 2 years of malnourishment and abuse. He would have to stay in the hospital for over 3 weeks to get healed up physically.
Okay.
And while there, he would give his statement to the police of all that occurred out on the farm while he lived there with Stewart. He told them where all of the bodies had been buried of the young missing boys. He knew that they were not there anymore, but he was able to tell them locations to at least go and look.
Right.
So armed with this info, the cops went back out for a full search of the Wineville chicken farm, but unfortunately, much of the evidence had been destroyed before Stewart skipped town. They did find the holes that Sanford had referenced covered by layers of straw and dug through the loose earth, and this is where the officers found, deep in the earth, a layer of quicklime. That takes us back to the doctor and the quicklime
So he didn't move them, he just filled the holes with it? Oh,
I think so. The lime was mixed with human hair and skin. While they didn't find full bodies in the grave for evidence, they were able to also recover a tooth that they knew belonged to a child between the age of 11 and 12.
Okay.
There was also just a strong scent of decomposition in the chicken coop. And as they continued to search, they found several finger, foot, and hand bones.
Okay.
Near the house, they found a burned human skull, Boy Scout badges, drawings of yachts, a library book, and a gray hat that had been worn by Nelson Winslow. They also found the murder weapon, an axe soaked in blood with human hair. So even without the full bodies or direct ways to link Stewart to the individual victims, they had enough evidence to make an arrest. But now they just had to locate this fugitive on the run.
Right.
By September 15th, the story had spread throughout the national newspapers. Headlines began calling it the Wineville Murder Farm, and pictures of Stewart were included as the main suspect they were on the hunt for. Alongside his picture was also Louise, and they couldn't hide for long. So Louise and Stewart, after leaving the farm, had gotten to the Canadian border, and as soon as they crossed the border, they split up. Stewart went to stay with his sister, Winnie.
Okay.
Winnie, at this point, had heard all of the news about the crimes, and she had heard it straight from her own daughter's mouth that Stewart had basically made Sanford his own personal sex slave, and yet she helped hiding her little brother. I don't understand this family.
No.
The police would show up at Winnie's house, and she would help hide him and help him run and evade the police. But after a week of helping him, she did start to grow paranoid, and she told him he had to find somewhere else to go. Fuck Winnie.
Fuck Winnie. Winifred.
His next plan was to hop on a cruise ship that was coming into Vancouver, but when he went to purchase the ticket, all he had was US dollars, and they denied him.
Okay.
In front of a large crowd of people, Stewart began throwing a little temper tantrum about not getting a room when he had the money to pay for it. And by calling all of this attention to himself, people began looking at him. And they recognized him because news had reached Canadian papers by this point as well. It didn't take long for the authorities to show up. Somebody went and called the police. And with that, 22-year-old Stewart Northcott was arrested.
Good. And still
Thank God.
Crazy. He's only 22.
The same day that he was apprehended, Louise was also caught trying to purchase a train ticket using a $50 US bill in Canada, and she was also immediately recognized and arrested. I think it's funny that they were both found on the same day.
Yeah, that is interesting.
The mother and son duo would then be extradited back to the U.S., and Stewart would be charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the Winslow brothers and the young Mexican boy he decapitated. At this time, they could not technically connect him to any other murders, although they had the confession from Sanford of many others.
What about Walter?
We'll get to him in a minute.
Okay.
The skull connected them to the decapitated Mexican boy, and the belongings and tooth was enough for the Winslow brothers. They never found any actual evidence to connect Stewart to Walter Collins, but based on all of the information from Sanford's account, Walter was the boy brought there along with all the others.
Right.
Of course, Stewart denied everything, especially that he had abducted Walter Collins. The police called Christine Collins to tell her that they strongly believed her son was a victim of Stewart, but she refused to believe it.
Oh, well, of course.
Because his body was never found.
Yeah.
You can't blame her too much here, considering how the LAPD had already treated her.
Right.
She had no reason to trust them.
No, and of course you want to hold out hope.
Yeah. While Stewart was awaiting trial, he said he suddenly wanted to confess to the murder of Walter Collins, but not to the police. He wanted to talk directly to Christine instead.
Oh.
So she agreed to meet with him at San Quentin. She was hoping he would provide her details of where she could find her dear boy's remains and finally get some closure. But disturbingly, after she traveled to the prison and arrived, Stewart changed his mind. He told the guards he no longer wanted to talk to her and that he didn't know anything about Walter Collins. He was an innocent man. It seemed he found another way to fulfill his sadistic urges at this point by torturing the families of his victims.
Fucktard.
He's the worst. However, Louise would then step up and confess to killing Walter Collins, and being that she was the first to strike him with the axe, she decided to take all the blame for his abduction and killing. She was still continuing to protect her sweet baby boy monster.
All right, well,
whatever, mama.
Own up. You need to, I guess.
On December 31st of 1928, Louise would be tried and pled guilty to the murder of Walter Collins. She was sentenced to life in prison. Back then, child killers would almost always get the death penalty, but women were excluded from this, so she was spared the death penalty.
Okay.
Lock her up. Stewart's trial began on January 11th. Before the trial, he went through several defense attorneys before deciding that none of them could really help him and he would just represent himself.
Of course, because he's the
crazy.
smartest.
This was the trial of the century for the time. It was very anticipated and it was in all of the papers. The prosecution had their star witness, Sanford Clark. It was hard for Sanford, though, because with his uncle defending himself, he had to be cross-examined by him.
Oh my gosh, that would be so freaking triggering.
Your own abuser.
Right.
But Sanford, at this point, he said he was strong and he was ready to finally stand up to his uncle.
Yeah, he can't do anything to you right there.
He can't hurt him. And he wanted to make him pay for all the years of abuse.
Good.
When he was done, he left the courtroom and knew that he would never have to see his uncle again, and he felt grateful and relieved.
Man, I'm so sorry for what Stanford went through, but maybe that was the universe's way to make sure that this wouldn't go on forever. There was some kind of curse with this family. A child was not supposed to be born, and somehow it happened, and he had to be the one to put a stop to this
evil
line of family. But then there's still Winnie out there. But her boys seem okay. It's like it stopped at her.
It kind of stopped, yeah, because Jesse was great.
Right.
And Kenneth was the other brother. Nothing happened with him.
She was the last bad apple.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Also in the trial, both of Stewart's parents would end up testifying. His father, George, would tell the court that he was deathly afraid of his own son, and he believed Louise was too, although she would never admit it. He talked of how Stewart was always the one in control from a young age, and they dared not cross him. He said, "Spoiled is no name for him. I would say he's ruined."
Well, at least his father testified.
Yeah, against him.
Yeah.
Now, Louise would take the stand and continue to vouch for her sweet little boy, urging the jury to be soft on him because he had a hard upbringing. It is in this testimony that Louise would bring up a shocking accusation that she wasn't even the real mother of Stewart.
What?
That, in fact, he was born to her daughter, Winnie, through an incestuous relationship between Winnie and her father, George.
Okay.
Whether this is true or not, no one knows.
Well,
it's possible.
It would make sense then why Winnie is so, this is my little boy. And it would make sense why his grandmother may have ended up looking at him a different way.
I don't know.
Like, yeah, it could be that it's that fucked up and the grandfather's like, well, this is my own mess.
And that's why he wouldn't step forward.
Right.
Because he couldn't. And that would also explain why there was a change in dynamic between George and Louise. Because she was like, you fucked up and now you're my bitch.
Yeah.
So to me, this kind of seems credible.
It's possible.
But we also know Louise was not a very reliable witness. After all, she was a pathological liar.
That's true. That's very true.
She would say anything to try and protect darling Stewart, whether he was her son, grandson, whatever, lover. I don't know.
Too bad there wasn't DNA testing back then. We'd find out.
I know. But it didn't work. The jury saw him for the monster that he was. And on February 8th, 1929, after 27 days of trial, the jury reached a verdict within a few hours. He was guilty of all 3 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to death by hanging.
Okay.
While Stewart awaited his march to the gallows, he would continue to taunt the victims' families, this time focusing on the Winslows. He would tell them that he would confess what happened to their boys and point them to their remains, and then recount it just like he did with Christine when they would show up at the last minute. He also confessed to around 20 murders, and then also said, "Just kidding, I'm innocent."
Oh my goodness.
He would lead police on goose chases, drawing up maps of where he buried evidence and bodies only for it to be fake when they showed up. He was continuing to get his rocks off in whatever way he could. Sadistic motherfucker.
He was having many last laughs before they took his life.
Yes. But finally, the day did come 18 months after his sentencing on October 2nd, 1930. He was marched to his hanging spot. While he was usually quite loud and talkative at the prison, on this day he was quiet and reserved. His one request was that they played his favorite song called Song of Songs. Once it was finished, 24-year-old Stewart Northcott was blindfolded and led up the steps to the noose. It was reported that he cried and begged for his life and that they had to drag him up every step. As they put the rope around his neck, he screamed to the crowd to pray for him and began pleading to the hangman for his life. And then the lever was pulled and the trapdoor opened up. Stewart would not die right away.
No.
He would actually struggle at the bottom of the rope for 12 minutes.
Okay.
It was a very slow and painful death. And there were many spectators there that were happy that he went out that way.
Yeah, he deserved it.
I kind of agree. Louise Northcott would end up serving 4.5 years at San Quentin, and then they would later transfer her to the Institution for Women at Tehachapi because she was crazy, I think. But this one's surprising to me. She was actually paroled 12 years into her life sentence on May 30th of 1940. Her husband, George, while she was locked up, had left California and bought a small farm in Parsonsburg, Maryland. When Louise was paroled, she joined her husband in Maryland and spent the rest of her life on the farm with him.
Okay.
George died in April of 1944, and Louise would die just a few months later in 1944 in November of heart disease. Everything they owned was left to their only surviving child, Winnie. Christine Collins never quite came to terms with the fact that her son was a victim of Stewart. Because they had never found his remains, she dedicated her life to continuing to search for Walter until her death in 1964. Really sad.
That is really sad.
The effects of this case would linger in California for quite some time. Wineville could not handle the fact that their beautiful little town was associated with such a dark crime, and they voted to change the name to Mira Loma, which is what we know of it as today.
Okay.
The LAPD had to work hard to regain the public's trust, and now parents had to begin having those tough conversations with their children about being aware of child predators, not getting into cars, shattering our children's innocence to protect them. As for Sanford Clark, he was never tried for his part in the murders of the boys because he was also a victim.
And he was still a kid.
He was, however, sent to the Whittier School for Boys to help him work through his trauma. They had wanted him to go there for 5 years. And he says that it felt like a safe haven that really saved him and gave him the rehabilitation he desperately needed to move on with his life.
Okay, that's good.
He only stayed for 2 years because they felt like he had everything he needed and would not be a threat to society. And in 1935, at the age of 23, he would marry a woman named June McInnes, and they would go on to adopt 2 sons. Sanford never wanted to have children of his own. He was afraid of his genetic lineage and passing on the crazy.
Oh, yeah. I would be too. I mean, it literally is your grandparents, your mother, your uncle, if that's all you know.
Yeah, and there's plenty of kids that need a good home.
Yeah.
And despite everything, Sanford actually would go on to live a very exemplary life. He served in World War II, and he would work for the Canadian Postal Service for 28 years. He and June remained married for 55 years.
Oh, wow.
His kids loved their father, and he never spoke of what happened to him in his teenage years. His boys didn't have any idea.
Okay.
It was too painful. And his name had been, I think, struck from the news. So because he was a minor, not everybody would know. So it's not something that his boys would have come across. They had no idea.
Okay.
He did suffer from nightmares, survivor's guilt, horrible headaches, and thoughts of suicide. His wife recalls walking in to find him in their bedroom with a gun in his mouth one day. He struggled.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I don't know how you won it. But then when his boys were older, they were in their late teenage years, there was a murder that happened in the area they were living, and Sanford became afraid that his story would be brought up and that he would be seen as a suspect because of his past. Mm-hmm. And in that happenstance, he did not want his kids to find out through newspapers or something. So he sat them down and told them the whole story. His sons would end up going on to help write the book of his life, which is called The Road Out of Hell. And that is the main book that I used to write this episode.
Okay. Well, I'm glad his sons were supportive.
Me too.
Or that he felt like he could finally tell them and then have them understand. And they also ended up growing up in a different time than he did.
Yes. Sanford would never get the chance to read this book that I mentioned, as he would pass away on June 20th, 1991. He was surrounded by all of his loved ones, and he was 78 years old. And this is a really sad part. On his deathbed, Sanford's son, Jerry Clark, told his father that he loved him so very much. And Sanford's last words back to his kids were, "Why would you?"
Oh.
So poor Sanford never forgave himself.
No.
For what he had done all those years. He lived with that. It was really hard for him. He tried to rise above it. He lived a very good life. He adopted these boys, but he always in his heart and his soul felt like he was responsible, which is really just the psychological torture that he must have lived with his whole life is just unbelievable.
Well, I can't imagine. Takes a lot of strength to continue doing what he did, but at the same time, if you're not able to look past your part in it, what a torturous way to keep living, man.
But we all know that without Sanford being there and stepping up, a whole family of 5 would have been killed.
Oh, this would have gone on for a very long time.
Stewart would have maybe never been caught. He had his mom. His mom was protecting him. They could have been, like you said, Bonnie and Clyde and just killing little boys all over the place.
Go to a new city.
Sanford's actually the hero of this story.
Yes, and I wish he had a chance to understand it that way before he died.
I really wish he had seen the book when it came out and seen the response from the world.
Yeah.
So I hope he's resting in peace somewhere now and moving past this, because he, Stewart got to just die and go on. But Sanford was the one that had to live with all of this forever.
It's just, that's horrible.
And one of the podcasts I listened to when I was preparing for this was talking about this is why sometimes it actually is better for someone to have a life sentence versus a death penalty. Although I don't think Stewart would have ever felt remorseful if he hadn't been hung, you know?
Oh, I don't think so at all.
So that is my story for today.
Wow.
I don't even know. So many twists and turns, and
it really was
shocking.
It's a shit show.
Yes.
It's incredibly sad. All those boys.
I know.
All the ones we don't know of. All those little Mexican boys in the beginning that he doesn't know what happened to them. I hope that they were just dropped off somewhere, but
I don't think
probably not. Yeah, I don't think so.
They found several finger bones and, all of that. And the forensics weren't good back in this time for them to have connected all of that. If this had happened now, we would know a lot more.
Yeah.
But I'm just glad Stewart was caught before he continued to do more, because this was not a man that was going to stop.
No, he was just accelerating.
And Mama was going to help him forever.
Crazy.
I don't know, what would have kept happening. So thankfully, Sanford was there.
Yes. Well, thank you for going down this route for me. I've been at her a little bit. I'm like, Kendra, I have to stop being the only one that ends up with fucked up cases.
It's true. We had this conversation and then I texted you and I said, I found one.
It wasn't exactly something to be excited over, but at the same time, I was kind of holding that space for a while for us.
I didn't even know, because I had Walter Collins on my list. And that was when I started preparing. I was like, I'll do Walter Collins now. Mm-hmm. And it took me to this.
And that's how all of mine ended up being the way that they ended up, because I'm not covering massive serial killers or anything. I just end up in these really fucked up family situations.
Yes.
Like this, where there's so much more to the story than someone was killed. Here's the perpetrator. And it's not until you start digging into these stories that you get all these details and you're like, whoa, wow. This is insanity.
And I will say, this family was Canadian.
What does that mean?
I think you and I were talking about, at some point we were texting back and forth and I said something about Canada. We needed to look in Canada.
Oh, that's true. Because we haven't really covered Canada.
And this came up. I mean, it didn't happen in Canada, but it was a Canadian serial killer.
That's true. Well, thank you. Please come back next week for our lab reports. And it was brought to our attention that we probably need to explain what that is if you haven't been listening for, a long time, because we haven't explained it in a while.
We're just like, send them in.
So lab report is a personal story. It doesn't even have to be a personal story, just something maybe that happened in your hometown. It can be true crime, paranormal,
spiritual,
aliens. It can be a story that you've written. I've still have wanted one of those to come in. If you write really good stories,
do it.
Tell me it's fiction. We still want to read it. But it is a special episode where we read your stories.
You know how we are doing this podcast. We go all over the place. We do true crime. We do conspiracies. So think the same thing with lab reports. There's really not a topic that we won't read.
There isn't.
You send the story in. So do it.
Send those to lucidlabpodcast@gmail.com.
In between our episodes, you can check us out on social media. We are on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, all at Lucid Lab Podcast, one word. We look forward to sharing some stories and a couple of mini episodes next week. And in the meantime,
stay very lucid, and I hope you are part of a semi-normal family.
Yes, we are all realizing it's not as common as you would think.
It's not. Anyway, take care, guys. We love you. Goodbye.
Bye.